As a geographer, I'm very much aware of the connections I have with people and things all over the world. So geography teaches us about these connections. So all my actions, I'm aware, well, I'm not aware, but I wish I was more aware, about how my actions might affect people in other places, how it might affect other species in particular ways. And so we're all points within these great connections all the way around us. And becoming aware of how we're connected in terms of the environment is what I'm going to talk about today. I just want to talk briefly about this idea of the Anthropocene. It's a new term which has been introduced by geologists, and geologists aren't very excitable people generally. They tend to study rocks, and things happen very slowly. Whereas for someone like me, a geographer, we get very excited about all sorts of things very quickly. And so when a geologist said that we're moving into a new geological era called the Anthropocene, we all got very interested in this and wanted to know what it was all about. But basically the Anthropocene suggests that we're going through a fundamental period of transformation of the Earth's surface and the Earth's climate of the sort of scale that you might have seen with the Ice Age or with another geological period, that the extent of the change, which is driven by humans, is unprecedented in some ways. If you think about the amount of soil movement caused by farming, we think about the widespread loss of mangroves around the world, 50% of the mangroves have disappeared. We think about climate change. Humans are driving a new era of fundamental geological change. And this is alarming. For many people it's very scary and it's very depressing. And I was talking to someone earlier who suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to have children anymore because she was so worried about the future. And I said, no, that's not the way to think about it. This is also a really good opportunity for us to sit up and think, well, what are we doing and how can we improve our behaviours and how can we interact with the world in different, more mindful ways. This image on the left-hand side, this is a feedlot in America, and this is an aerial Photoshop where you can see tiny dots on the left-hand side, which are cows. It's a massive feedlot that spreads for miles in every direction. And on the right-hand side, you can see where the waste of the feedlot goes. And so you have this sort of toxic algal bloom in this waste area. And this was seen from the sky. They were trying to take photos of a different phenomena, and they started taking photos of these massive feedlots running what they were. And it wasn't until later they worked out that this was the scale of the change we were looking at. If we think about the livestock industry, there's over 50 billion animals killed every year for food consumption. Now, if we just take a second to think about that, that's over 1 billion animals a week being slaughtered for our food production purposes. The land which is used for livestock production takes up over 1/3 of the Earth's non-ice surface. This is a huge amount of land, it's a huge amount of animals which are sustaining our human appetite at the moment. And as you can see down the bottom, 78% of agricultural land is devoted to livestock production. So livestock is massive. It's a massive, massive industry. And when we're eating animals, we should be aware of those connections we have and the impacts we're having from a sustainability perspective. If we look at what's going on around the world, we can see that the more developed a country is, and I do a lot of work in Southeast Asia, the more developed a country is, the more meat is consumed. Okay, so we can see some of the greatest consumers of meat are in the developed countries, Australia being one of the highest consumers of meat anywhere in the world. You can also see, we can't see that too well from here, but the USA, the darker colours are the countries with the highest consumption of meat products. So what we're seeing as the world develops is a new crisis emerging, which some people refer to as the Livestock Revolution. Because we're getting greater middle classes in places like China, in Latin America, more people having more disposable income, leading to more production of livestock. So even though we have 1/3 of the Earth's surface now devoted to livestock production, that's increasing. There's more pressure on forests, there's more pressure on all sorts of agricultural resources and environments, so that this hunger or this taste can be satisfied. So this is one of the massive processes that's transforming the Earth's surface. This just shows you a bit of an indication of the expected growth in meat production. I'll just point out very shortly here, we can see here this is the prediction for developing countries. So again, that's the emerging middle class, which is starting to consume at rates similar to what developed countries are consuming at the moment. So just here, you can see this line going up here. That's just showing developing countries and the rate of meat production and consumption expected as we go forward. So it's a massive challenge taking place within developed and developing countries. We think about Australia and the extent to which Australia has been transformed by livestock industries. This is a map produced by the government, which just gives you an indication of the types of land use activities in different parts of Australia. Now, this white territory here is grazing land, or the white territory. That's grazing of native vegetation. The orange land here is modified pasture land, so you can see all that land there as well. The bit in the middle here is protected, but that's probably because you can't actually run many animals on that, if any at all. And then there's irrigated pasture land right on the edges as well. So the actual percentage of land just for grazing is around about 55% of Australian land is devoted towards the livestock industries. And that's just grazing, that doesn't include feed crop production as well. So when we start including those things, it gets into an even higher proportion of the Australian landmass being devoted to these sorts of activities. Now there's all sorts of impacts from grazing, where you have soil erosion, you have runoff into local waterways that can cause various forms of pollution there. There's biodiversity loss, there's the changing of the local flora, so you have woody plants growing, and you would have seen some of those landscapes in the past. And you have this, and you have a lot of water usage as well. So because of that, there's all sorts of challenges that we need to be aware of. In addition to that, we've got the issue of climate change and the amount of emissions that actually come from the livestock sector to influence climate change at a global scale, but also in Australia. So we look at Australia, we can see that 10% of Australia's total emissions comes directly from livestock. And again, that doesn't include the feed crop production, so it's actually more than that. If we look at life cycle analysis, which is another way of measuring the amount of emissions from livestock, we can see globally it's around about 18%. And that includes the land use change, but a lot of the emissions come from methane from the animals themselves. So we're thinking about climate change. Not many people think, I should change what I'm eating. But obviously we should. This is one of the biggest contributors to climate change internationally. The Food and Agriculture Organization report suggested that climate change contributions from livestock was actually higher than transport. So how many times have you thought, I should get a bus, or I should ride my bike because it's going to be better for the climate? We should also be thinking about our food consumption patterns. But at the moment, we don't have any sort of campaigns that are trying to educate people about the impact of their food choices on climate. So this is a really big issue that we need more attention on. If we look at what's happening in Australia, we can get a feeling for the size of the industry. We've got around about 9 million cows every year being slaughtered for food. 700,000 bobby calves, they're the calves that come from dairy cattle, which then set off to slaughter if they're male. 33 million sheep, 5 million pigs, and 500 million chickens. So we're talking about huge amounts of animals every year being slaughtered for the Australian diet, with a lot of these brought up intensively. So a lot of people don't know that we have feedlots in Australia, so a lot of cows are finished off in feedlots for up to about half a year. That's for the intensive production system. Then we have the chickens themselves and the pigs as well, where 90% of those animals are brought up in intensive farming systems. In terms of the trends, we can see that beef and veal production is been increased around 1979, then since then it's been fairly steady or dropping off a little bit. The main growth has been in poultry meat, so chickens, and in pig meat. So we're getting more intensive forms of production. In terms of the issues to do with these intensive forms of production, there's obviously animal welfare issues to do with raising chickens and pigs in intensive industries. You can see down the bottom here a few images. But there's other environmental impacts as well. These animals need to eat. That food comes from feed crops. So 80% of the East Coast grain grown in Australia goes to intensive industries like this. So 80% of that food that could be feeding humans is actually going to these animals. which are then very inefficient in converting that into food for ourselves. And remember, we live in a world where there's growing populations, there's people who are very hungry, very close to us. I've been to Timor-Leste, where they don't have enough food. They have a hungry season every year, where people only have 2 meals a day rather than 3 meals a day, and we don't have enough food to provide for them. It's a really outrageous sort of situation we're in. So we need to really be conscious of what we're eating if we want to make effective, mindful change to the world around us. One of the things to note as well is if we think that we need this much meat, we can look at the growth in the amount of chicken which is consumed every year. In 1963 in Australia we consumed 4.2 kilograms of chicken per year, and that's increased tenfold in that time. So we're now consuming 43 kilos of meat a year. Obviously we don't need to do that. People were healthy back in the 60s. So there's this huge overconsumption of chicken meat taking place. There's a few more stats here about water consumption. Obviously livestock are huge consumers of water, again very inefficient in terms of our overall impact. So if you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to save some water, I'm going to have a short shower today, the average shower takes up about 35 litres of water per day. If we look at this is an indication of the litres per person per day consumed through food. And you can see 2,290 litres comes from, this is per day, per person, through our choices of our food. So taking a shorter shower doesn't really make that much difference compared to your food choices. And even cutting out one meat meal a day will make a massive impact on our environment. So the question is, how do we get to this? We can say that there's been a huge amount of marketing. There's a feeling that to eat meat is part of being Australian, and we've seen these, for me it's pretty horrible campaigns about eating lamb on Australia Day, and you're un-Australian if you're not eating lamb. There's a big disconnection between ourselves as consumers and the production systems, and so it's very easy to go down to the local Coles or Woolworths and see this sort of packaged meat where it's all plasticized and you have no connection to the animal that produced it whatsoever. So we don't have that emotional, spiritual, or even physical connection with the animals anymore, a lot of us. Obviously farmers do, they're in a different situation. And then we have the marketing itself, and I don't have the stat quite on me, but I think Meat and Livestock Australia last year spent over $100 million on advertising in Australia. So there's this huge marketing to keep us consuming more and more meat. So what should we be doing about this? Obviously becoming aware of these issues is one of the most important things. Talking to our friends and family about these sorts of issues. There's a lot of greenies out there who are doing fantastic things for the environment, but this sometimes somehow falls to the side, the actual food production system. So this is something we need to be aware of, and we need more action from environmental groups. We also need a new ethic, I think, where we start reconnecting with those animals beside us or around us. So rather than thinking of them as products, and that's their legal status in Australia, they're just products. In other countries they've got certain rights and protections, and they have welfare rights here as well. But if we can connect with them in different ways, and there's all sorts of fantastic eco-philosophies out there at the moment about connecting emotionally or spiritually with some of the animals around us. It's a minority of people who are interested in these sorts of things, and they've made some measurements of what we can do by what can be achieved by reducing our meat consumption. And this is just some of the findings which have come out recently. If everyone in the US ate no meat or cheese just one day a week, it would be like not driving 91 billion miles or taking 7.6 million cars off the road. That's just from one day a week. So imagine what can be achieved if you stopped eating 3 or 4 or more days a week. Reduced or no meat diets could return millions of hectares of agricultural land to regrowth and reduce climate change mitigation costs by 50% or more. And a reduction of 50% of animal products in the EU would result in a reduction of greenhouse gases and much more cropland. So there's all these global impacts we can have by changing our diets. It's all within our capacity. We can decide to do it tomorrow. The local impacts means there'd be much more land available for regrowth, much more biodiversity, the sorts of things we're all interested in if you're interested in the environment. Many more places where we can go and visit and have a good time. Because we're returning that land, over 50% of the land which is currently devoted towards livestock production. So just in conclusion then, I think for me anyway, being mindful about what we eat is realising those connections that go to other humans but also go to other animals and other species, and being aware of of each and every decision we make and how that affects those other species and other people. So it's about thinking across these networks and becoming empowered as a result of that towards global environmental change. So, thank you.